And I look forward to tomorrow night.
That will be fun. I want to welcome everybody. I'm here with my friend, with well-known speaker and author Os Guinness, to talk about his most recent book, Carpe Diem Redeemed, which is, frankly, to me, one of the most interesting and helpful books I've read in a long time. When people ask me, hey, Sean, tell me a recent book that you've read that was a game changer for you, this is a book that I've recommended to many, many people. So you're familiar with Oz. He's written a number of other books as well. Books such as Fool's Talk, which is a fantastic book about apologetics today, and also a book called Last Call for Liberty, which is very timely as well, and a number of other books. So, Oz, thanks for taking the time to come on. I know you've been doing a lot of these interviews lately.
Great privilege, Sean, and fun.
Yeah, this is. Well, let's dive into this book, Carpe Diem, and it's a book about time. So I guess my first question is, why write this book now? Is it the season where our culture's at? Is it where you're at? Why choose, of all the things you could write on, to write this book, Carpe Diem, right now?
Well, I wrote it long before the pandemic.
Mm.
The idea went back a number of years ago. I was coming back from Brussels in Belgium, the capital of the EU, to London. And just as you come into St. Pancras Station, there's a number of dilapidated Victorian buildings, and one of them was splattered with graffiti. But you could see this particular sort of poem. You only live once, and it
Mm.
doesn't last. So live it up, drink it down, laugh it off, burn it at both ends. You can't take it with you. You only live once. Now, you'll recognize that immediately as the YOLO philosophy.
Yeah.
But many of those people who subscribe to that rather ridiculous philosophy forgot the original formulation was you only live once, if then.
Hmm.
In other words, life is short and fragile and vulnerable, and nothing's reminded us of that like the pandemic. I love the fact that if you read, say, the famous verse in Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, the Hebrew actually is not vanity. It's not futility, meaningless vanity. The Hebrew word, and this ties in with the COVID-19, is shallow breath. And
Huh.
you could translate it short, short breath, short, short breath. Life is nothing but a short, short breath, which of course comes down to us. How, if life is like that, do we live wisely and well the
Hmm.
short life we have?
So at the heart of this book is that this YOLO philosophy is really nothing new at all, is it?
Not at all. I mean, it's a bastard version of Epicurus.
Hmm.
Eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die. And of course, a lot of people have lived like that without thinking about it.
What is the illusion at the heart of you only live once? Like, in terms of the thinking that drives many people, what's the biggest illusion that you think they're missing?
Well, I read a book on this, and basically it boils down to grab it while you can. In other words, the YOLO philosophy is short sighted and selfish, and just a matter of seize the day for yourself.
Hmm.
And if we all do that, we'd live a world with chaotic narcissism and selfishness, which sadly many people are doing. And that is not the best way to live life well. So the book is an examination of the three big philosophies of time and an argument that the biblical view, the Jewish and Christian view, is by far the richest and deepest of the three.
For those of you who have just signed on with us here, we're here with Os Guinness talking about his book, Carpe Diem Redeemed. Make sure you hit the subscribe button because we have some further interviews coming up as well. So tell me, essentially, what's the heart of the question you're addressing or tackling in this book? What drove you, kind of the golden thread that goes through the book, so to speak?
Well, if life is short like that, and for all of us, there's a moment we realize I am I, and I won't be here forever. And the day is soon coming when I'll be gone. And no one in the world would have any clue that I've been here, except for a
Mm.
tiny handful of people. There'll be no trace of us on the earth after a relatively few number of years. So,
Mm.
in the light of that, how do we live well? You have that enormous challenge. You think of Milan Kundera, the unbearable lightness of being. if this brief life is the only rehearsal for life, what does it mean?
Mm. That's a great question. I think people have been thinking about this a lot, especially the pandemic. And then even just yesterday with the passing of Ravi Zacharias, there's an awful lot of people pouring out love, just saying, here's a life lived well. So I want to come back to your book, but maybe could you share maybe one insight that you took from his life or his ministry that's meaningful to you?
Well, dear Ravi came with his own story from an attempted suicide in India to Canada to America. But he was, I think, known for his unique blend of evangelism with a great heart for the heart of the gospel and yet apologetics, really addressing the mind and not the heart. And he was tireless in doing that.
He really did that well. He got to people's hearts and got to the question, so to speak, beneath the question. Now, you wrote in the book, you said something I thought was really interesting. You said, quote, "We have less control over our time than ever, which is the real index of slavery." What do you mean when you say technology has turned us into slaves?
Well, you think back to Karl Marx, he made a big splash with his term wage slaves, factory workers working for the bosses, and so on. But if you look at our modern world, we are driven by what's called fast life, 24/7, 365 pressure. The most powerful invention in history is the clock. It was invented around 1300, but it didn't make much of an impact broadly until the 19th century. And then it was coordinated, little puffing trains with big fat railway timetables, and whole continents were coordinated at the same time. But then the sense of precision. And you think of a sundial, you knew what the morning was and the afternoon and, of course, the night. But today with atomic time, Lewis and Clark, the American explorers, as they went west, they agreed to meet at a certain place at a certain time, and they were 9 days apart, and they called it relatively punctual. Now, you can't dock a space station 9 days apart. They'd be dead. We're living under fast life. The Africans say, all Westerners have watches, Africans have time. And we don't realize how much we have become time slaves. Now, Filipinos have a saying, all Westerners are people with a God on their wrists. Look at your watch and off you go. Of course, today, with your generation, it's in your hand. You're looking at your cell phone to get the time if you want it. But we are slaves of fast life. And time is pressing us, making life even shorter than ever.
Now, this pressing nature of time because of clocks and because of smartphones is new, but you point back to really creation itself and the Sabbath as being one of the solutions to this rush slavery of time. What did you mean by that?
Well, she'll leave that for a second and go back to the big three, because I'm a great believer, as you know, in the simple phrase, contrast is the mother of clarity. You can understand the good news of the gospel in the Bible if you see it in contrast to the alternatives. And there are two big ones. The oldest, and the one that's in the East today, but was true of the pagan world and the ancient world, is the view of time as cyclical. It's a wheel. And obviously, they've looked at the seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall, and they've projected that sense of cyclical time onto the universe. So time is a wheel. And as you know, we're driven by desire, which leads to craving, which leads to attachment and binds us to the wheel. But if you have that cyclical view of time, it's going round and round and round and round, reincarnation, it's going nowhere. History is going nowhere. Time is part of the world of illusion, Maya, in which we're living. And that's one view of time. The important point is no high view of history.
Okay.
But above all, no high view of human nature. Because freedom in the cyclical view of time is not freedom to be an individual, it's freedom from individuality. Because the sense that you're an individual is an illusion which keeps binding you to the wheel. Now, you've got a lot of people who follow that idea in California. It's very popular. And they take, say, reincarnation 60s line, groovy man, groovy. Nonsense. In the East, that idea of going round and round and round is a matter of fateful resignation. That's the cyclical view of time.
So the cyclical view of time seems that there's some truth in this. Like when we look at the seasons, you see summer, winter, fall, repetitiveness, and sometimes it just feels like our lives are going on and on. What ultimately did the cyclical view of time get right? And why ultimately do you think it falls short?
Well, the Bible has that limited cyclical view of time. You can read it in the book of Ecclesiastes. You know, Lightfoot's famous song, The Seasons, is all about that, and so on. So there are cycles, no question. But as I said, the mistake is to project it onto the universe itself.
Okay.
Whereas in the biblical view, you have what Jews, and certainly I call the covenantal view of time. So instead of pantheism or monism, where one is all and all is one, you have a personal God who's a creator, who's created time and space, and he's outside time and space. So he's over time. Time has meaning, his meaning, and history is going somewhere, his purposes. So the greatness of this view, as we come to know God, know the Lord, we discover our gifts and calling. We become, and this is incredible, junior partners in his purposes. And that's why it's covenantal. With him, we're acting into history, making a difference in history. And you have the highest view of history. The Jews invented history as we know it, not the Greeks, the Jews. And you have purpose and human dignity and meaning in history. And that's an incredible view of time.
Let's unpack a little bit this distinction between chronological time and covenantal view of time. And by the way, for those who are watching, if you put some questions in as we get towards the end, we definitely want to take some of your questions for Os Guinness here. Now, before I read your book, I typically broke down, I said there's cyclical time and there's linear time. But you break down linear time into what you call chronological time and then covenantal time. Let's talk about chronological time first. What do you mean by chronological time, and what's the worldview behind it?
Remember, covenantal comes first. In other words, you have linear time with God's purpose and our partnership. That's covenantal. Now, the chronological view of time is the secularist view of time. And essentially, it's the covenantal shorn of God. In other words, God, the supernatural, heaven, and all that, cut it out. And so you just have chronological time. Now, it has no meaning in itself. So if humans want meaning in the 18th century, they certainly did and thought they could. They impose meaning. So this third view is a do-it-yourself view. When I was younger, I had at London University Bertrand Russell teaching. And you know, his famous picture of the universe is the Greek Atlas, a Greek giant, Atlas. And anyone who's seen a picture of Atlas, the original Atlas, he's carrying the world on his own shoulders. In other words, we make our own meaning and we impose it on the world. Now, in the 18th century, that gave rise through the Enlightenment to incredible optimism. We could do it. In the 19th century, we could direct our own evolution. But after the 20th century, world wars and genocide and Auschwitz and so on, the optimistic humanists who believe we can impose ourselves on time and history are far fewer. And you have many more of the pessimists like Samuel Beckett.
One of the things that you write is that secularists cannot face the reality of their worldview and how it approaches time. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you think there's no meaning in time to be discovered, we've got to impose it if it's there, and we can't. Reinhold Niebuhr calls this the redemptive view of history. The humans try and redeem it by their own strength. And if you can't, history is just a runaway engine. And who are we? So you have, for example, Samuel Beckett, and many people know of his famous play, Waiting for Godot. But one of his most interesting plays is a later play called Krapp's Last Tape. And you have a 69-year-old man playing tapes of himself when he was, I think, 29 in his 30s. But time has desiccated him into 1,000 fragments. And so he's completely alienated from himself, let alone others. And so the question for the atheist, if we're to make meaning out of time which has no meaning, how are we doing? And clearly, we're not doing very well.
So you say to not own this, is it a matter of inventing meanings, distracting themselves? What are the projects that you see within kind of a secular worldview to try to act as if chronological time really is covenantal time?
Well, go back to something I didn't put in the book and wish I had. There are two moments in all of our lives, whether we're aware of it or not. One is the moment when we're very small and we come to say to ourselves, I am I. No, we're born from our mother's womb, part of loving families we trust, an incredible sense of unity, a flooding unity, and then we become ourselves. Now, with people who have that underdeveloped, they're afraid of living, what's called separation anxiety. For people who have it too much, I am I and who but I, you have the narcissists who want to impose their will on the whole of life. That's one moment. The second moment is when we say, I am I, but I'm not going to be here forever. I said that earlier. Now, some people for whom that's overdeveloped have a terrible fear of dying, and they hardly live. Some people for whom it's underdeveloped, many modern people, think they can live life as an immortality project, stamp the universe with their names and achievements, and defy even death. But of course, we can't. Now we think of the president today with his name over all sorts of buildings, but the greatest narcissist in history was probably Ramesses II.
Okay.
No one has been more self-adulatory than Ramesses, but of course, he died too. None of us can impose our projects on the universe and on time and win. We can occupy space exclusively, but we can't transcend time.
Now, I see a question here from more orthodoxy that relates and it assumes some understanding on the past of a thinker, but I'll throw it out there and see if you want to comment. It says, does Oz think that secularist holidays serve as cultural liturgies in the sense that James K.A. Smith uses the term? Does that make sense?
I haven't read all of Jamie Smith. But I'll just say this about holidays. The pagan ancient holidays were celebrations of nature, fertility, and so on. What's distinctive about the biblical holidays, they are celebrations of history. What God did in a certain event, the Passover, Exodus from Egypt, and so on. Now, our modern holidays, by and large, don't celebrate much at all. Even, say, Memorial Day, we don't do much celebrating of those who died on behalf of our freedom. They're basically recreation, time off. I think, in other words, they're part of what Blaise Pascal calls. And a feature of our modern world, we surround ourselves with busy, entertaining distractions so that we don't have to think about ultimate questions, let alone the ultimate inconvenience, which is we're all going to die and life is short. So modern holidays, I'll leave Jamie Smith on one side for a moment. I think they're basically a grand form of diversion, but fueled by consumerism and business and so on.
One of the things you write about covenantal time is that it's linear, but it's also purpose-filled. But you also made a point that really got me thinking how this covenantal view of time stems from the character of God we see in the Abrahamic religions. What is it about the character of God that enables us to have this covenantal, purpose, meaning-filled kind of time?
Well, you know, the Greeks, if you read a lot of their philosophy, and you're a philosopher, Sean, they talked a lot about things like Aristotle's unmoved mover. That is nonsense compared with the biblical Jewish and Christian view of God. As one rabbi says, God is the most moved mover.
Huh.
He cares, he loves, he's grieved, he is jealous. Now, in terms of what we're saying, God has purpose, he has
Mm.
intention. So he invites us in when we come to know him and live our callings out before him to be a part of restoring and repairing the world and working towards the great day when he's going to return the world to what it once was. So that sense of the will of God as his purpose of love and justice and freedom, it's marvelous. God is personal. He's not
Mm.
impersonal at the ground of being in the Eastern understanding of God. He's personal with passionate purpose, the most moved mover.
I love that. That's a great way to state it. Oz, one of the ways that you have helped me the most is in your writings on truth. I think you've done more to clarify and define what truth is and how it's connected to freedom than any other writer that I've seen. So I wasn't surprised that in your book, Carpe Diem Redeemed, you brought in a relationship between time and between freedom. What is that connection between what it means to be free and our understanding of time?
Well, as you point out, often truth is essential for freedom. As our
Hmm.
Lord says, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So as we come to know him, because he is the truth, then we enter into the fullest, richest view of freedom in time that we can have. But we are captives of time, and our time will run out.
Hmm.
And you think of our Lord's story of the man who wanted bigger and bigger barns, and finally God said to him, no more laters, tonight your soul is required of you. And we know that. So our lives are short. The best way to live the most is to live in his truth and to read the signs of the times, as the Bible puts it, and then to seek in our individual lives to serve God's purpose in
Hmm.
our particular generation. And then
Hmm.
we enter into the fullest and most rewarding freedom. So whether we succeed, things go well, or whether we fail but are faithful, life is rich.
And the freedom is because we know we're serving the Lord and we can put the results in his hand rather than the results that maybe the world would define us by. Is that a part of the freedom that comes from living our lives committed to Christ?
Absolutely. Interestingly, the word slavery in Exodus under Pharaoh is the same word in Hebrew as the word worship and service of God. But of course,
Huh.
as many have pointed out, his service, God's service, as the Anglican prayer book puts it, his service is perfect freedom.
Hmm.
But we're under his lordship and we're doing what he calls us to do as the people created in his image. And we come into the richness of the destiny he has for us.
That's a very countercultural view of time, that rather than we having the power in our own lives, actually laying it down for an authority, so to speak, is what brings freedom in our lives and in our time. I think that's beautiful, and that's something we need to recover. Let me ask you this question. As part of the covenantal view of time is the idea that our past shapes us powerfully, but it doesn't determine our future. The way you wrote in the book is you said there's no fate, inevitability, or necessity. There is forgiveness and redemption. Yet we have this call out culture that is so quick to demonize sins from our past. So I'm curious how you encourage forgiveness when people are afraid to be fired and shot down for even admitting the slightest indiscretion they've ever made in the past. How do we meet that balance?
Well, start, Sean, by getting people to see freedom is a great gift to the Bible.
Hmm.
You go to the Egyptians or the Babylonians, they weren't free. It was in your stars.
Hmm.
You go to the Greeks, you take a play like Oedipus Rex. Behind everything, fate, the oracle. You think, well, that's the ancient world. Surely today we talk about freedom. Secularism and atheism has absolute zero grounds for freedom.
Hmm.
You go to Spinoza or Karl Marx or Freud or J.B. Watson or B.F. Skinner, or come down to Richard Dawkins or California Sam Harris. Sam
Mm-hmm.
Harris's book on freedom has a puppet on the front
That's
with
right.
dangling on strings. Freedom is illusion. And you can see running
Hmm.
through the ancient world and modern atheism is determinism, chance,
Hmm.
and necessity. Now, here's where the biblical view is quite different. God is sovereign. That's another word for freedom.
Hmm.
We are not sovereign, but we are significant. We're free and responsible. So freedom, the one thing we'll never know what tomorrow brings. All the
Hmm.
nonsense of our pundits who tell us what's nonsense. Humans are free.
Hmm.
Now, one thing that's tied into that, and I love it, is forgiveness. What forgiveness does, and part of its preciousness, is its link to freedom.
Hmm.
Because the burden of the past, whatever you've done, gone, forgiven, dismissed as far as the east is from the west. But not only that, the future, you're no longer fated and determined. It is written, kismet, and all that nonsense. You have the future of another chance. So you take the simple idea
Hmm.
every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. Why? Because of
Hmm.
freedom plus forgiveness. So, followers of Jesus, Jews and Christians together, we are the guardians of freedom through great truths like freedom plus forgiveness.
One of the things you talk about is that we're free, but we also make choices that start shaping our character deeply over time. That habits become character, character becomes destiny. So we're free, but we're also shaped deeply by our actions and the choices that we've made in the past. How would you balance the two of those together? That we're never fully determined, but our actions do really shape and build a character that gets solidified to a degree.
Mhm. Well, in my other book, the other one you mentioned, I have what's called the paradox of freedom. The greatest enemy of freedom
Hmm.
is freedom. So
Hmm.
you just take the example of the Exodus. Here you have not only God against the gods, but you have Pharaoh against Moses. Moses, the leader of the slaves, he's almost powerless. Pharaoh is the most free man in the entire world because he's the most powerful man in the entire world. He can do whatever he likes. By the end of the story, Pharaoh is unfree.
Hmm.
He's stuck in
Hmm.
his own obsessions
Hmm.
and addictions. And his even courtiers say, let them go. They will be ruined. Egypt will. No, he's stuck. Freedom can become its worst enemy because, as you said, we can make through freedom bad choices, and then we become the prisoner through character of our own
Hmm.
bad choices. And
Hmm.
bad choices made in freedom lead either to addictions, take the drug, opioid crisis, or to obsessions.
Hmm.
Obsessions are addictions to crazy ideas. Addictions are practical slavery in
Hmm.
behavior.
Hmm. You talk about how freedom invites a sense of humility. What did you mean that our the fact that we're free invites us to have a sense of humility towards God and towards the world in which we live? What's that connection between those?
Well, always we're very small, a little finite people. And we're here by virtue of
Hmm.
God's creation at our greatest. And when we come through grace to realize we've been forgiven of all the rotten past we had, everything boils down to, as Paul says in Corinthians, what do you have you didn't receive? Or W.H. Auden, the great English poet, one of his last poems has the great line, let all your thinks be thanks.
Huh.
Why? So much that we have is just sheer grace of
Hmm.
God and other people. You know, I'm responsible to my parents and to a thousand other things I could say. And the idea I've done it myself, if I start to think about it, is absolutely ludicrous.
Hmm.
So each of us should recognize where we are and where we've come from and how much is ours and how much is others,
Hmm.
and be incredibly grateful.
Uh,
Do you know the story of Salvador Dali? My wife knew him when
Okay.
she was younger, but he was had a terrible family background growing up.
Okay.
And one day he had a monumental row with his father.
Huh.
And he went to his own home, forgive me using the word, he masturbated, put his semen in an envelope
Hmm.
and sent it to his father and just wrote on the back of the envelope, paid in full.
Oh
In other
my.
words, that was his gratitude for life.
Wow.
And it's an appallingly reductionist selfish, narcissistic view. And if we start thinking about it, all of us should be humble and grateful because of so much. I mean, imagine the privilege. We're not born in some earlier century where we're in hovels. We're living in America, the freest, still, most prosperous country in the world. Our gratitude to being born in this generation, and so on. We should be immensely humble, grateful people when we start thinking of all we owe to God, our culture, our parents, and 100 other things.
That's a wonderful perspective, even in light of how difficult things are for so many people right now in the pandemic, to try to see the things we can be grateful for, as difficult as that is.
But again, I think the pandemic has made us humble because at the heart of modernity is control, reason, rationalism, science, technology, punditry, management. We are in control. No, we're not. And the virus has reminded us we're not in control. And I was born in China, and you probably know I was at one stage when I was very small. We were in a famine. 5 million died in 3 months. 90,000 in America. 5 million in 3 months, including my brother. But no food, no medicine. When we joined the refugees looking for food, there were 10 million on the road. And what we've seen here is nothing. Nothing. Bad as it is. And so people really need to think through what is life all about and how much we owe.
One of the critiques you offer in the book is of secular progressivism and religious progressivism. Let's take these in turn, because I think your ideas here are very, very helpful. So with secular progressivism, there's an assumption that being progressive is good within itself. Yet you make the argument that secular progressivism borrows a biblical view of time and lacks the philosophical assumptions to justify itself. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I sort of talked about the chronological time earlier, and the fact is we're not imposing our will with mastery in history. That's the underlying problem. But you can see that for many people, that works out in the things that you're talking about, because we simply are not in control and masters of time as we would like to think that we are. And once again, we have to be far, far more humble. Now, want to press me a bit further on that one?
Do I want to press you further on that one? What I guess the part that I was looking at is in the book you talk about this secular progressivism that assumes progress is good, and yet you push back on that and argue where's this standard of good, and it borrows a view of time that's from the covenantal view of time.
Yeah. No, G.K. Chesterton points out they talk of progress, but they don't give you any standard by which to judge you've actually progressed, moved forward. You could equally be going backward. But it boils down to the simple idea: the newer must be truer, the latest must be greatest. So, when you come to secular progressivism, say a progressive left person disagrees with us over, say, marriage, we are, quote, on the wrong side of history because they presume they're on the right side. Now, in fact, they're producing a harvest of sexual, social chaos from which America will find it very, very hard to recover in the name of progress. And it's absolute nonsense. As in Barfield, C.S. Lewis's friend called it, this is chronological snobbery. The idea that latest is actually greatest. C.S. Lewis called it serialism. The 1, 2, 3 must lead to 4, and so on. Not at all. You can actually go backwards, as Chesterton points out. And in many ways we are. Now, that's the secular progressive left, and there's an arrogance there. The stuff about the arc of the universe is long, but it leads to moral justice and so on. Well, they quote Martin Luther King, and he pointed out in his sermon in a synagogue in Los Angeles, when he said that, 1968 or whenever it was, he points out that is borrowed from the biblical view. In other words, providence has that long arc of history. And of course, providence has at its end not only God's purpose, which we discussed, the Messiah.
Mm.
So you not only have the promised land, you have the promised day of the Lord, when the Lord's Messiah will come and restore things to what they're supposed to be. That's the myth of the progressive left. And then you've got, as you said, the religious version. And that's basically from Schleiermacher onwards in the 18th century, a capitulation to the spirit of the age. I often quote Dean Ing, the Dean of St. Paul's, who said, "He who marries the spirit of the age soon becomes a widower." The spirit of the age is forever changing. You follow this thing and it's gone. You follow the next thing, it's gone. And you can see a lot of Protestant liberalism has just chased the latest idea, every idea in skirts, and it just looks silly, and it's committed theological, institutional suicide. And that lies behind the failure of Protestant liberalism.
I thought it was really interesting that you quoted the book by John Gray, who his book on atheism, he says even views like secularism and Marxism, which assumes the world is advancing somewhere, actually borrows a biblical view of time, that there's such a thing as progress. You can't get that within secularism itself. But then when it comes to religious progressivism, you made the statement in the book, you said at its root, it buys into a faulty view of time. How does religious progressivism, so to speak, adopt an unbiblical or just a faulty view of time itself?
Well, for the reasons we've been discussing, they don't have a right to that covenantal view of time, that time has meaning, history is going somewhere, and God's purposes will work out. Reinhold Niebuhr, who's probably the best Christian who's written on time and history, he has the wonderful line I've got in the book, "The end is not the end," by which he means there are two views in the Bible of the word end. You can take it as the Latin word finis, ending, conclusion, full stop, period. And there's a lot of that in life, above all, death. But the other meaning of the word end in the Bible is the Greek word telos. End as objective, goal, climax, culmination. And as Niebuhr points out, in the biblical view, there are a lot of endings in the first sense, but God is always working out his ends in the second sense, which is one of the reasons the Christian, the follower of Jesus, has tremendous hope, however dark the hour is. Quite differently from the atheist, who either sees it happening now or has no hope.
Oz, in just a minute, I want to get to what you talk about in the book, how we discern the times today, because how we discern the times shapes if we use our time well. If you're enjoying this conversation, give us a little thumbs up there. It helps us spread the word so more people will hear this. And make sure you subscribe. We have some other interviews coming up in partnership with YOLO Apologetics you will not want to miss. So, Oz, you and my dad are two of the people that I know who seem to both have their fingerprint, kind of their pulse on culture, so to speak. So, how do we discern the times? As Christians, how do we understand what's going on and think about it Christianly?
Well, let's say never more than imperfectly. In other words, we have the prophets in the Bible, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on. They what I call capital P prophets. When they say, "Thus says the Lord," they had got it directly from the Lord, and so their word was sure, and their interpretations were very discerning. Now, we only have the challenge. So in Chronicles, that famous verse, the men of David were skilled in reading the signs of the times to know what course Israel should follow. Or our Lord himself, he says, "You guys can read the weather. You're great meteorologists, but you don't read the signs of the times." Now, what do they mean? I understand that to mean we've always got to look at the events of our day, not as random or whatever, but as under the aspect of eternity and in the light of the imperatives of the kingdom. And when you put it in those two ways, then you begin to see things. You look deeper and further and over the horizon than, say, someone on NBC or Fox News or whatever. You're looking in a different perspective, and you're able to read imperfectly, I began, of the signs of the times. So I've tried to do that for 50 years.
Mm.
I don't think I've been horrendously wrong on anything major, but always try to see things in the light of eternity and in the light of the kingdom.
Well, that was definitely a British understatement because you've been studying culture well for decades and given some insights that I personally glean from. Here's a question for you. It says, what is Mr. Guinness's thought on the idea of God and time during the COVID? Stay in place, slow down. If you're writing this book now, in other words, in light of what COVID has brought, would you add any other insights or change things or give any encouragement or criticism in light of the quarantine and pandemic?
Well, a lot of things to look at. But if you think the pandemic hit during Lent and Passover, and both of those are the two festivals of self-examination and self-reflection. And I think certainly we who are followers of Jesus, but everyone, say, who are citizens in America, we need to take the chance to say, where are we? Are we where we should be? Now, I was talking earlier about short breath. The very symptom of the virus hitting is that short breath you have in Ecclesiastes. So all of us should come out of this with a sense of the shortness of life and how we live what Socrates called an examined life, living well, living wisely in light of the shortness. So that's the personal thing. Now, I personally think Americans have to ask a lot because this is the time when America is most deeply divided as at any time since just before the Civil War. And the horrendous thing about the pandemic, Americans have deepened the division in the pandemic. Every other major country in the West has pulled together. America's torn apart even more in the pandemic. Now, people have got to say why. I've written another book on that. Last Call of Liberty is about that.
That's a great book,
America,
by the way. Got it right
as
here.
Thank you, Sean. As we come out of the pandemic, what I've called there the ideas coming from the French Revolution, they're accelerating. The reliance on state control, the reliance on the world of experts, and so on. You can see the pandemic is actually favoring the wrong side, and we need to have voices very clearly interpreting it. So the pandemic helps us look. You look at the global level, we now see China in a new light. To me, that's welcome. What actually shocks me as a European, no one says America is the land of the free, China is totalitarian. That's the biggest difference. And that's the biggest struggle that will be there the next 50 years. In other words, the pandemic is an incredible moment to rethink, above all before the Lord and our personal lives, but all these other levels too.
In your book, Last Call for Liberty, you kind of made a reference, correct me if I got this wrong, but during the Trump administration, kind of for our culture to hit pause and ask, what kind of revolution do we want to have? French Revolution or American Revolution? And this is kind of a pause for us. It sounds like you're extending that a little bit and saying the pandemic is also a pause, asking us kind of in a pivotal sense, what are we going to decide moving forward? So did I get that correct? And what are some things for us watching right now we need to know to be on the right side and help moving forward?
Well, go back to that idea at the beginning of the book. Deeply divided. Why? Is it the president? No, he's not the cause. He's the consequence. Is it the social media? They've reinforced it. They're not the root of it. Is it coastals against the heartland? Partly. You guys are in California. There's a real difference in California and New York and the Midwest. That's part of it. Is it the nationalists over against the globalists? George Soros, borderless world and all that? Partly. The deepest division, though, is between the understanding of America and freedom coming from 1776 and the American Revolution, which was largely, but not completely, biblical. And ideas that have come down from the French Revolution. Now, they are playing out now. You can see them in the university world through the so-called Long March. University world has been given over to ideas like political correctness, postmodernism, multiculturalism, the sexual revolution, et cetera, which have nothing to do with the American Revolution. Now, the tragedy is that unlike the 1850s, there's no Lincoln. What Lincoln did was address the evils, in his day, slavery, in the light of what he called the better angels of the American experiment. Who talks about the better angels today? Who even understands them? So the others, the president talks about make America great again, but he forgets it's not the military. It's not the economy. You've got to ask what made America great in the first place. And that's what needs defending.
That's a great insight. On the note of kind of freedom and where culture's going, I want to read a section from your book that really jumped out to me, and then you can just comment on it. Break it down for us a little bit. You said, those who perceive themselves as victims and respond by portraying themselves as victims end by paralyzing themselves as victims. The reason is that in seeking to use the past as an instrument of power, victims remain prisoners of their past and never become free. They become prisoners of their own resentment. The Jews, by contrast, look forward, not back. In short, victim playing is disastrous and counterproductive, both to the victims and to the victim society. You said homosexuals may complain of homophobia and Muslims of Islamophobia, but Christians who play the victim card and complain of Christophobia have not understood the heart of their own gospel. Go into some detail what you meant and what you're getting at there. That was really powerful.
Well, put it this way. No people in history have been more victimized than our friends, the Jews, the people of God. Scattered, persecuted, and attempted extermination. No people. And yet they rightly know that they're responsible, not for what's been done to them, but how they respond to what's been done to them. So they refuse to play the victim. Now, that victim playing is at the heart of what's called critical theory, as you know, cultural Marxism. In other words, Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse and others, they realized you'll never have a revolution in the streets. You need it through the gatekeepers, but you do it through critical theory, dividing the powerful from the powerless, the majority from the minority, the oppressors and the victims. And then you use victimhood as a tool of power to replace the status quo. And of course, you replace one and you have to replace another. There's no truth, as you said elsewhere, only power. And so it goes on. So victim playing, more victimized than thou. If I can be the victim, you've got to give me compassion and so on, sympathy, money, reparations, you name it. But in the long run, I'll weaken myself by that. And that's what the Jews, to their credit, refused to do because of the biblical notion of responsibility and human dignity. So we need to resist that. In the Bible, you have a tremendous compassion and passion for the vulnerable and the marginalized, the poor, the widow, the orphan, but not encouraging them to play the victim. And that's a very different thing. That is the progressive left power play that is disastrous. No, it's once again, the American Revolution, which is biblical, the French Revolution, which is anti-biblical, that's an example of what comes from the wrong toolbox.
So it sounds like you're trying to, or you are dancing between the scripture's emphasis on those who are marginalized and hurt and genuinely victims and not downplaying that. But this power move, it's interesting to me that you described it as a power move where victims are put into a position of power over other people as a means of control that can never really bring any kind of freedom.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, you see, many young Christians today, let me be blunt, hear the word justice, stand and salute. You got to say, whose idea of justice, a biblical, prophetic idea, or the critical theory, neo-Marxist idea? And a second, is disastrous. I had an email this morning, a guy saying, you call for self-criticism. What do you think about all the racism in American history? And I said to him, you cannot explore too realistically the evil of racism, slavery, whether it's the Africans or whether it's the Native Americans. You've got to own up to that. But the question is, do you put your research into a biblical framework or into a critical theory framework? And too many of the young Christians have been seduced by the progressive left and not realizing they're following the wrong siren.
John Wilden asks a question: what's the best biblical response to critical theory inside the church? John, there's some writings by Neil Shenvi, Shenvi, online, and his material is just dynamic. I would look up his material, John. Os, one of the questions I have for you, I was reading a book recently by somebody more on the left secular side talking about fighting racism. And they said the solution to fighting this is to work hard and push and fight for justice. And nowhere in the entire book was there anything about forgiveness. And I thought, this is a works-based means of salvation that is missing the very thing that can set us free. So it seems to me one of the themes, and I've asked you this a couple times, throughout Carpe Diem Redeemed, is really one of the big things you're saying is we can only be free to use our time when we experience forgiveness and we extend forgiveness to other people. Is that at the heart of this book?
Absolutely. And I've actually written another book, come out next year, that's much more on this. But put it this way, again,
Okay.
1789, 1776. 1789, you address evil, oppression with power, victim playing, and so on. And you just have wrong retaliation, reparation, goes on forever. And America becomes culture warring, the Corsican blood feud writ large. Now you compare that the biblical way, yes, evil, addressed, penitence, confession, forgiveness, reconciliation, and enemies can become friends. If you read the book of Acts, the gospel is equated with peacemaking. And you compare the Pax Christi, the peace of Christ, peacemaking with God, with Pax Romana. The Roman historians, Tacitus and many others, they admit the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was domination. In other words, when one is dominant and no one can challenge them, you have peace. But it's the peace of despotism. Tacitus said that. Rome created an empire of peace and the world was desolated. That's not the Christian way. We've got to, in other words, when we come to freedom, the atheist has no grounds and the Bible is unique, Jewish and Christian. When you come to justice, it's different. We both believe in justice, but within this framework or that framework, you come out and quite differently. So particularly young Christians, they should never be seduced by critical theory and the mere repetition of the word justice. Justice, yes, but which understanding and which resolution?
I'd love to hear you talk about this, and this gets me looking forward to your next book because it's timely, because I'm working with students and these ideas are coming up all the time, and these kind of distinctions are really, really important. So I'll look forward to that coming out. If you have a question, we have a little bit of time left. Some of you have posted some questions before if I missed them, especially for Os related to his book, Carpe Diem Redeemed, and just how he sees the day, discern the times, and think about time as a Christian. If you have questions on that, throw it up there and I'll see if I can get it to him. But you talk about how we should hold a kind of resistance thinking as Christians, which is a term that C.S. Lewis used. What do you mean by resistance thinking?
Well, think back to the beginning. Abraham, when he's called by God, the first word is negative, leave. And he's called, as the Jews say, leave your country, culture, and kin. The three shaping influences in our lives. The first word, negative. So Israel later is to be an anti-Egypt and a counter-Babylon. And our Lord calls us to be in the world, but not of the world. So we should be the counterculture. Or to put it another way, the way I like to put it, God creates order. Through sin, we humans create disorder. So when God acts into history through his people, us as followers, he is turning the world upside down, but actually turning it the right way up. restoring the order that he had in mind. And so we should be that counterculture. And I love the fact, the English Revolution was the first of the five. Or put another way, when at Yorktown, 1781, the climax of the American Revolution, the British troops, when they marched out to surrender, were ordered to play the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." Now, that ballad went back to the 17th century, where it was Christian, because the Christian Revolution had the idea, freedom is the man who turns the world upside down, but turns it upside down in order to turn it the right way up.
Os, this is so rich and so helpful. I have a ton more questions for you from my book, but I also want to honor your time and coming on. One thing you've done, I do have a quick question for you. You've been really supportive of our program at Biola in apologetics. Even though some of these questions of critical theory seem to be asked a lot, you still really value apologetics. In fact, the book you wrote before this one was about that. So why do you think apologetics is so important for the church today?
Well, because part of our great battle is a battle of ideas. It's not only ideas, but it's a battle of ideas. And so apologetics addresses the craziness of many of the ideas in our world, and it's absolutely essential. Now, as Ravi pointed out, we referred to him earlier, apologetics and evangelism should be seamlessly one. And I would argue, too, that apologetics and that prophetic word should be one. So apologetics is not just 1,001 reasons why Jesus rose from the dead, but addressing the ideologies of our time and the mentalities and the crazy thinking of our time. So apologetics is central to discipleship, but it has to be tied in with all the other aspects too.
That's really beautiful. One of the ways I put it is there certain timeless questions. Does God exist? Is God good? Did Jesus rise from the grave? Is the Bible true? But then there's also timely questions, which come up in the certain cultural moment in which we find ourselves. And that's what you talk about in the book, Carpe Diem Redeemed. So for those of you who've been watching this, I've been asked a few times, one of my favorite books over the past year, and I have recommended this book to a number of people. So I hope you'll get up a copy. It's not a very long book, and I have a master's in philosophy, Os, but I read it twice and then a third time before this interview because it's so rich and there's so many things I just paused and thought, okay, I got to highlight this and think about that because that's really, really insightful. So thanks for writing the book. Thank you for being such a supporter of our program at Biola. You speak for us many times, come on the podcast. Your voice is just so appreciated. So hang on for just a minute. But to the rest of you, if you actually are interested in studying apologetics and never thought about getting a master's, come study with us at Biola. We have a full distance program. We also have a certificate program. I will put a discount code in the description for this where you can save a good chunk if you thought, you know what, not ready for a master's, but I really want to get trained to think in the way that Os is talking about. So thanks so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful evening.